I talked to Mike Thompson, Deputy State Superintendent with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and he says there was a lot of thought process that went into each recommendation, and he also shares a message for parents like Tiffany.
These are recommendations and guidance, and this is a pathway to schools to begin to look at what type of instructional design they'll need to put in place during this pandemic. And so they're not mandates, they're not directives, they are recommendations. And the first part of the recommendations start out with collaborating with your local public health departments to determine what's our best way to keep kids safe. And around that, there's kind of three, four elements around that safety. We do know because of this pandemic, we're going to have to continue to physically distance kids, what we call social distancing. How do I do that on a bus? How do I do that in a classroom? How do I do that in the hallways? They'll have to figure those protocols out as they move to open their school building. How do they keep less kids in a classroom than they've had before? That's one of the things they'll have to figure out. Those might drive what instructional design they need to put in place. Are they going to have everybody return at once? Are they going to have a hybrid model where some kids return on some days and then learn virtually? Are they going to have the high schools learn virtually and spread out the elementary and middle school kids throughout those buildings? Those are the various instructional designs that they'll try to put in place around that provision of physical distancing. They're going to have to think about how do they isolate kids with symptoms and illness. So if a kid gets on the bus and has a temperature, we're going to make sure they don't get on the bus. How do you do that at home? How do you do that when they get on the bus or transportation? How do they get on before they reach the school building? Once they are in the school building, how do we make sure that when kids do get ill, they're isolated from others? That's around kind of the how do we treat this pandemic during the time kids are at school? We're gonna as we've all learned over the last several months, what have we learned about good hygiene and how do we practice it? How do we instill that in kids about coughing and possibly wearing masks in certain situations and washing your hands and keeping your hands away from your face, all those types of things. And then schools have to deploy new ways to disinfect and clean their buildings like they've never had before, what we often heard as deep cleaning. How are you going to do that? What supplies do I need? And when am I going to do that? Those are the kind of the areas that districts are considering in planning to make sure their schooling situation is as safe as possible for kids. The recommendations are many, and you can see they're varied. They're around how do you the number one priority, how do you keep kids safe and as safe as possible in a return to school. And then the second part is around the instructional designs that you may deploy in place to make sure that you can meet these safety standards for kids. So what went into it is a lot of discussions with Department of Public Health Services, local public health agencies, and then educational organizations from across the state on what their questions were about what they need to do to reopen schools. Say that they want to be in constant communication with their school, and I'd say the same thing to schools, be in constant communication with parents, because as always when kids go into the school environment, parents want to know that their kids are safe. They wanted to know that prior to COVID, and now with COVID they need to know what precautions districts are taking to make sure their kids are as safe as possible. That's what school districts are doing. I can tell you when school districts open in the fall, and if they bring in kids, they will have situations, protocols in place to make that environment as safe as possible. Parents need to know what those protocols are. They need to feel good about those protocols. And districts will very likely have to have different opportunities for parents who, even with all the protocols and precautions in place, parents still do not feel comfortable sending their kids into that school.